What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are finally here with Absolute Green Lantern and the origin. So, we're going to do this a little out of order from the way the comics did it, but this initially opens up 5 days before the events that we'll talk about here in a minute. And you initially pick up in a coffee shop with Hal Jordan and John Stewart and Jo Mullein, also known as Jo Mullein. Now, Jo Mullein is actually a relatively new Green Lantern in DC Comics. When I say relatively new, I mean, she was introduced in 2020, but when you talk about, when Hal Jordan was introduced, Guy Gardner, Kyle Rayner, John Stewart, she hasn't been around nearly as long. She's kind of a Green Lantern without a home, if I'm being honest, in the sense that she doesn't really protect Earth in the same way that John, Kyle, Hal, and Guy Gardner do, that she actually protects a place called the Far Sector. It's just one of these situations where, because Earth already has so many Green Lanterns, none of which are unpopular enough for DC to kill, they're trying to figure out ways to make her character interesting and to keep her relevant, and DC hasn't quite figured it out yet. The Far Sector storyline is cool, but it's just one of these things where she's just kind of a lantern over there. So to see her here is pretty dope. John Stewart's also the guy who was the former Marine and became an architect. Hal Jordan is a little bit different. Hal Jordan is not the test pilot that you guys are familiar with. In fact, he's actually a collectibles dealer, which is pretty interesting, right? A pretty cool shift with his character. The problem with this is that as they're talking, and you get a little bit of backstory in the sense that Shadurner had at one point served alongside Guy Gardner in the police force here in this town, and then ultimately left and just hasn't quite decided to come back yet. There's some bikers riding through the town. And then suddenly one of them crashes into just this giant green wall. And that what ends up happening is when the rest of them get out there, they almost see this gigantic green dome that hovers around everything. And this is where stuff gets a little bonkers. Now, one of the things to understand here is that while Hal Jordan is not playing the traditional role of a test pilot, as we're used to, a lot of his character elements remain the same, right? He's the first one out there saying these guys need help, somebody call an ambulance. So he doesn't really hold back and say, well, we should wait. He's not really like a coward or anything like that, right? He's still very much the guy who jumps out into the heat of battle if it's necessary here. And when he gets up there, he says it's like there's some kind of a wall that it gives, but it's like a force field in a movie. Now he's initially told by Jo, stop touching this, right? And she says that green glow could be radiation for all we know. But the response of Hal is that biker must have hit this thing at 100 miles an hour. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and his head, there's nothing left of it. And that's where they're kind of looking around, and Jo's I think it's curved. Right? So they're kind of figuring out the nature of this as things go on. And in fact, this other guy's biker friends, they show up here and then they leave. They just turn around and ride away. And they're kind of trying to figure out why, right? It's they didn't even see that their buddy was dead on the road. And that's where Jo Mullein is it's like they don't see anything strange at all. What in the world is going on here? But then Jo looks up and she sees what looks to be the Green Lantern symbol in the sky. And then Abin Sur shows up. Now, this is a huge deviation from Abin Sur as he's traditionally depicted, both physically within DC Comics as far as his appearance goes, as well as the role he plays. In the traditional Green Lantern mythos, which something to understand is that when Jeff Johns came along and did Green Lantern Rebirth, he kept the original Hal Jordan story intact, right? So Hal Jordan, the way he was introduced in the old DC Showcase comics, as well as how he was getting his story done in Green Lantern Secret Origin by Jeff Johns, by and large, it's all still pretty much the same, right? 80 to 90% of the original material is carried on. And so the way the original story played out was that Abin Sur had just kind of crash landed on Earth, and that initially Guy Gardner was supposed to be the first Green Lantern, but the ring chose Hal Jordan instead. And so Hal Jordan just kind of goes on to become a superhero after getting the ring, learning what it's capable of, that sort of thing. That's not how it plays out here. That instead, what ends up happening is Abin Sur addresses the crowd and he says, I am the Abin Sur. Have understanding that I come to you from the Green Lantern. I exist at the green level of light. Be without fear. Now, initially, everybody's kind of freaked out about this, as you could probably expect, right? A giant green dome just erects over a city. An alien who looks pretty funky comes down and starts talking about being without fear. Most people are going to freak out, if for no other reason than the fact that, we as humans don't know how to function if we don't have total control of a situation, or at least some understanding. Now, Guy Gardner, as he's presented here as basically the sheriff of the town, is not really the Guy Gardner that we're familiar with from DC Comics, from the main DC universe. Guy Gardner in the main DC universe is kind of a dick, but we love him for it. He's that one guy in the the friend group that like, is going to be rude to pretty much everybody, but you can't just really bring yourself to get rid of him because you love him too much, right? The lovable jerk, essentially, in DC. This guy's very different, right? He's not nearly as hardcore. Instead, he's kind of what you would expect from a small town sheriff who's met by a situation that he can't really begin to understand. And that's why he says, like, I'm the sheriff, it makes me the authority here, the law, right? You understand what laws are. And that's when Abin Sur is like, I have understanding. Judgment will now commence. And at that point, he sticks a hand out and it becomes a kind of standoff. And no one in the town knows how to respond, right? Like Abin Sur says, judgment is in progress. Guy Gardner, you are not an entity who currently exists in the emotional spectrum of light. Be without fear. And he says, be entirely without fear. And so where this whole kind of situation is going down, you have Jo and you have Jon Stewart, and they're kind of trying to talk the situation down to a degree. And so when Jo addresses the group, she makes a really interesting case here. Right, where Guy Gardner says, like, we don't know what this thing's capable of. The response of Jo is like, I mean, we can make a guess, right, from the spaceship and the bubble that's over our entire town. And initially, Guy doesn't realize it's a whole bubble. He's kind of so caught up in the heat of the moment that he's not really looking around at everything else that's going on. And that's where Jon Stewart says that force field overhead extends to the town's limits. It's a dome, right? We saw a motorcycle crash into it. The rider didn't make it. And that's where Jo says that's what it's capable of. What we don't know is what it wants. So what do you want, Guy? Do you want to escalate this? Do you want to make it worse? Or do you want to keep it reasonable? And so following that, Guy Gardner orders everybody to lower their weapons. But it doesn't make any difference because where Guy Gardner says, like, let's start again, we don't understand Abin Sur. We do not have understanding. Tell us what you want. Abin Sur fires on Guy Gardner and kills him on the spot. And then literally at that point, Abin Sur is just like, judgment is in progress. Be without fear, and just starts destroying everybody. So seemingly being without fear means to be without life. It's kind of how you could interpret this. Now, of course, everybody starts firing on him, and then that's when you start to see green hard light constructs popping up in the sense of a kind of protective force field right around Abin Sur. And he just keeps saying to all of them, be entirely without fear, and kills them all in the process, or at least most of them in the process. And we're talking about like decapitations, cutting off hands, I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff that's going on. But through it all, Hal Jordan is just like, okay. He just walks up to Abin Sur with a gun in his hand and points it at him. And Abin Sur just looks at him and he's like, Hal Jordan, judgment is in progress. And in fact, initially Jon Stewart comes up and kind of gets Hal Jordan to lower his gun, if for no other reason than to kind of help everybody else who's essentially injured. And Abin Sur looks at Jon Stewart and just says his name, right? Jon Stewart, be without fear. And then just takes off. Literally, Abin Sur just flies away. And so this creates a lot of confusion here, and it creates a lot of ambiguity as to what it all means. And so what this does is it kind of gives us a chance to jump back into how the story properly unfolds to give us a better indication of like what all's playing out here. Because after this is all said and done, you initially have Hal Jordan who's just walking along a back road, right? And it's just this voice in his head, be without fear, right? This voice that says, you are in the absence of light. I am the secret heart within every star. Be without fear. Hal Jordan, you must be without fear. And Hal Jordan kind of says it to himself, right? And he's like, I am so scared right now. I am so terrified. But then a cop just kind of pulls up on him, right? And the cop isn't really there to harass him or anything like that. It's just a dude walking down the side of a road in the middle of a desert. It's kind of like, okay, what's this guy doing, right? It just seems a little weird. The problem is that things start to go sideways when Hal Jordan isn't giving any direct answers to this cop's questions, and he keeps his hand in his pocket. And so at that point, the cop just kind of thinks like he might have drugs or a weapon or something along those lines. And literally, it's just like, it's a weapon, isn't it, right? Like, is it a weapon? Answer me. Are you carrying a weapon? The situation escalates like that, and Hal Jordan gets exceedingly sad and scared when it does, because he tries to tell the cop, like, don't, right? Put your weapon down, like, do not, like, my name is Hal Jordan, I'm from Evergreen. But the cop, again, trying to maintain control of a situation that he thinks he doesn't have control of, escalates the situation even further. And then for a moment, you see Hal Jordan's hand, it's completely black, and then everything just kind of goes sideways, right? The cop just vanishes into thin air. like literally just disappears, right? All that's left are like the smoldering ruins of where he used to be and some badges. Now, that's an important thing here, right? The fact that you have his gold badge that's there and any other gold parts of his outfit that he was wearing at that point in time. And so that's when you switch over to a place called May and Mo's Diner. Now, that's when Hal Jordan comes in. And again, the situation almost kind of repeats itself, because the reason being here is that we're going to see a news blip here in a second, and it's going to instill a level of fear in people here because they don't fully understand what's going on. And while it may not necessarily affect them directly, again, we as human beings don't really know how to function when we don't have at least some understanding of what's happening around us. It makes us feel helpless, and in that helplessness, we become fearful. And in that fearfulness, we become violent. And so in this instance, when Hal shows up, he just asks for some water and he just sits down at the bar and just kind of chills, right? And, she's like, are you okay? Like the waitress is like, are you fine? He's like, no, something happened. But then suddenly the TV shifts, right? And you end up getting this kind of news blip where this person comes on and they say, what you're seeing is helicopter footage from Evergreen, Nevada, a small town about 15 miles from the California state line. This footage is live and unedited. It has not been tampered with in any way. And so what you end up seeing in this town is just a giant Green Lantern insignia that's just crash landed in this place. And the reporter says the destruction seems almost total, though no bodies have so far been recovered. We're trying to get information on the exact nature of this object. Now, as you guys can tell from this drawing here, the object itself did not flatten the entire town. So the question has to be asked, if it only flattened one portion of the town, what happened to everybody in the town? Where did everybody go? Why is it considered to be an almost total loss? And basically, pretty much everybody's dead. And that's what the people in this restaurant ask, right? Like, what in the world is going on? Because suddenly the reporter comes in and is like, I've been informed, we can't show you any more of the footage. An official statement's being prepared. We'll have more updates when we can. And it just cuts off. Now, here's an important thing to understand here. In the most recent issue of Absolute Superman, one of the Brainiacs addressed the idea of Owens, right? Those individuals who historically create Green Lanterns. It's the first real connection we have in the Absolute Universe between the various titles. And so if that connection is maintained and if that connection is real, it's entirely possible that the peacemakers that we see in the Superman comics, they're the ones that shut this report down, right? The government effectively blocked it out. And so what you end up getting is effectively panic, right? That the people in this restaurant, it's not enough to fly into hysteria, start freaking out and destroying things and so on and so forth, but it's a question of what happened in Evergreen? Like what in the world went on? And so that's where Hal Jordan says he said his name was Abin Sur, that he came from somewhere else, the symbol in the sky, that belonged to him. And that's where the waitress is like, you were there? Like you were in Evergreen? Like that thing on the news was some kind of a spaceship. And the response of Hal, he called it the Green Lantern. And another guy here just kind of starts flying off the handle, right? Just seemingly in a way that makes no sense whatsoever. But he's like, what are you talking about, right? What does that mean? Now, again, this is fear setting in, right? This is this guy who doesn't understand what's going on, and that lack of understanding makes him feel helpless. And so because of that feeling of helplessness, he starts lashing out. And this woman, this next to him even says hey, look, it's whatever's going on, it's not his fault. But the response of Hal is, yes, it is, right? I made a mistake. I wanted to be a hero. And Abin Sur, he did something to me, gave me something. He gave me a weapon. Now that's the wrong thing to say when you're standing in a diner and all these people are just fearful, right? These little small town diners, yeah, they all carry guns in case some drifter comes walking in trying to rob the joint or do harm to people. And no one's going to feel bad, right? They're going to kill this guy, bury him out back, and you'll never see or hear from him again. And so this kind of situation is what Hal's wandered into. And that's why the waitress is like, are you talking about a gun? And she doesn't say, she's like, there's a gun under the counter, but she doesn't tell him that. And Hal's just like, no, it's worse, much worse than that. And she just says, drink your water. And this other guy is like, what's in your pocket, son? And it's the exact same scenario with the cop unfolding again. And even Hal says that. On the highway, there was a cop. He asked the same question. And he's like, I should really go right now. And again, this guy's like, what happened to the cop? What did you do? And then immediately goes to attack Hal. Again, trying to have some control over the situation. He pulls Hal's hand out of his pocket and it's revealed to basically be the Black Hand. The hand in turn levitates this guy into the air and kills him on the spot. And much like what you saw with the police officer, that gold piece comes crashing down onto the ground. And that's where Hal says, it's the hand, right? I'm holding it back. It takes all I have to hold it back, keep it away from people, but I cannot control it. It responds to danger. And that's where the waitress fires on him. And then in turn, Hal Jordan momentarily loses control and the waitress gets everybody in the restaurant killed. And so that's why you have Hal Jordan who's just kind of sitting there. And then suddenly what ends up happening is that this Black Hand starts to heal him. Right? It restores him of his injuries. Now, there is a bit to explain here when it comes to the Black Hand, because this is not a new concept in DC. The Black Hand's been around for quite some time, and in fact, the Black Hand was at one point a villain. I'm not aware if he still exists in DC Comics anymore, but that guy was an instrumental part of Blackest Night in DC, which is to say, Black Hand became the first Black Lantern, right? The Lantern Corps that is essentially a Lantern Corps composed of the undead, zombies, right? And that the Black Lantern rings would attach to individuals who were dead, but the only way to charge the ring was to kill living beings. And that in turn would bring the rings up to full power, which made them astronomically powerful. The whole idea of Blackest Night was that it was the Black Lantern Corps essentially taking over. And it wasn't until the White Lantern started to emerge going towards the end of Blackest Night and going into Brightest Day that you actually saw the Black Lantern Corps defeated. But one of the other things to kind of discuss here is the nature of the emotional spectrum. And that's what makes this so wonky, is because when Abin Sur is talking about things like, I am on the green level, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the Green Lantern mythos, the emotional spectrum is almost like the Force from Star Wars. But instead of there simply just being the light side and the dark side of the Force, that the Force is composed of emotional states. So Sith, for example, Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, we could say, for example, they derive their power from like fear. I mean, as Sith, they derive their power from like just heightened levels of emotion, right? You know, from fear and rage and what we would consider to be the more reckless emotions, more passionate emotions. But kind of keeping this simple, they would derive their power from fear. So they would be, for example, like Yellow Lanterns. And then you could say that because the Jedi are more emotionally stable, right? And because they are people who fight on behalf of good and they're constantly keeping their emotions in check, it takes a lot of willpower. So they would likely be Green Lanterns, potentially Blue Lanterns, depending on, you know, what kind of hope they imbue. But again, the role here and the bigger point that I'm making is that different Lantern Corps tap into different parts of the emotional spectrum. And there's benefits and drawbacks to all of them. But the bigger thing here is we don't know if that emotional spectrum is being rolled over here in the same way, or if there's something much larger going on. What you're not seeing here are traditional lantern rings. What you are seeing play out here is that instead of a ring of power being given to a person who can use that ring of power for their own ends, that instead the very powers these people wield seem to tie more into their personalities and their emotional states than anything else. And so instead of the situation where a person is given a power ring and they draw on the ring's power to achieve any particular goal, instead the power that they're given is more of a reflection of them. And how they use that power and how that power manifests is a direct reflection of who they are on a personal level. So again, it's very ambiguous here. There's a lot of questions that are not being answered. But the other part of this is that as Hal Jordan stands in this diner, Sojourner pops up, right? Jo Mullein shows up here and she looks like a Green Lantern. And that's where you get a conversation between the two of them, right? She asks the question like, what happened to you? Right? Like what went on here? Like the last I saw, the last that I remember, you had a gun in your hands and you were pointing it at Abin Sur. And now you're here with like this glowing black hand and all these people are dead. So what in the heck happened? She's like, because you never did give that gun back to John, right? You never handed it over to him when he asked you to. And that's where Hal actually kind of materializes a gun in his hand and is like, I guess I never quite got around to it. Now there are theories out there that for Hal Jordan, that he has the black hand because the gun itself is a representation of that, which is kind of representation of the fact that he is potentially a serial killer or something like that, keeping a very dark part of his history secret. And the black hand is kind of the physical manifestation of Hal's darker self. We don't have the answer to that. Again, it's just kind of a fan theory that's out there, but Hal even tells her, like when he just materializes a gun out of thin air, he tells her like, you should get out of here, Jo, right? He's like, this thing thing, it's hungry, or something like hungry, something alien, but it wants the light. And Jo asks, like the green light? And he says no, like any spectrum of light. It doesn't really want to absorb it, that's not the right way to say. It wants to supersede it, overturn it. It wants to win the argument, Jo. It's very, very old. And Jo's just kind of like, I mean, you're weirding me out here, right? And Hal just kind of goes on. He says, it should have been forgotten. It should be weak. An idea nobody believes, but something fed it. Something gave it a chance. Now it's everywhere, every little piece in everything, all the way out there, all the way in here. And I'm fighting it, Jo, as hard as I can. I don't want to listen to it. I do not want to, but it keeps telling me that I was right. Now, the question of who it is that fed this thing and keep it alive, we don't fully know, because again, that goes into a lot of unanswered questions. We know the absolute universe was created by Darkseid himself. So this is a universe that is powered by the very belief system that Darkseid has. So it could be that Darkseid just created this and then threw it into this universe and it's been here since. Something to also keep in mind here, these superheroes that exist in this universe, they don't know that Darkseid created their entire reality, right? It's totally separate from the main DC universe, but they're completely unaware of that. They don't know how it all originated. And so again, there's a lot of ambiguity. The only real cool thing that comes out of this, as far as hard knowledge goes, is that you pick up with a bit of a conversation in the aftermath of everything that initially happened before Hal Jordan was just wandering down the road. And what goes on is in this conversation between John Stewart and Sojourner and Hal, is that John Stewart says, okay, right? Like we're all feeling the adrenaline of what we just experienced, right? We all kind of have a few regrets on how we could have handled things and so on and so forth. And he says, it's natural to think about what we might have done differently. It makes sense. He says, but like I said, Hal, maybe you were not wrong. What's happening here, whatever alien judgment is being levied upon us, I don't think anyone's coming to save us from it. So at this point, the conversation takes place while Abin Sur is still there and passing judgment on the entire town, however long that takes. And so in turn, John asked the question, so if it comes to it, do we take Abin Sur out of the equation? And if we do, I think I know how we can do that. And he holds up this gold ring. And what he realizes, and what he's effectively telling them, is that the powers of Abin Sur, and seemingly the powers of the green light, do not affect the color yellow. Now that is a major part of the Green Lantern mythos. And a lot of people have kind of expressed confusion as to why, right, given the various histories of Green Lantern and whatnot. The long and short of this explanation is that long before Geoff Johns showed up and took over the Green Lantern mythos, that yes, you had the color yellow, which was the weakness of Green Lanterns, and that was it. Geoff Johns largely considered that to be just a silly weakness if there was no real reason behind it. And so he started introducing the idea of entities that occupy and represent the emotional spectrum, the entity of fear, the entity of willpower, the entity of hope, so on and so forth. The entity of fear specifically is Parallax. And while the original Emerald Twilight storyline, when Hal Jordan declared himself Parallax and wiped everything out of existence, while that story at the time that it was written in the early 1990s was just Hal Jordan adopting the name and nothing more, Geoff Johns came back and actually established that at one point in time, the Parallax fear entity was locked inside the central power battery of the Green Lantern Corps, which is where the Lantern Corps derives their powers. And that because of that, Parallax was able to influence the Green Lantern Corps in a variety of ways. Because Parallax is literally yellow, that's where the color yellow became the weakness of the Green Lantern Corps. But more so than that, Parallax was able to directly influence Hal Jordan over time. And so that's why you see a lot of these explanations that when Hal Jordan declared himself Parallax in the original Emerald Twilight story, it was actually him just basically being possessed by the Parallax fear entity. It was a change that Geoff Johns made during his run on Green Lantern. But again, we don't know how all these little plot threads are going to tie together. We don't know if Parallax is real. We don't know why it is the color yellow, gold, what have you, is basically immune to the influence of the Green Lanterns, because there's so much information we don't have. But it is amazing. And honestly, it's one of the coolest stories out there. The mystery is really what just kind of keeps me coming back. For those of you guys who haven't really been keeping up, not a whole lot's happened so far. It'll be huge now, but up until this point in time, all we really had was Abin Sur, basically the guy who traditionally turned Hal Jordan into the Green Lantern after bypassing Guy Gardner. But within the Absolute Universe, it's a whole different ballgame, because Abin Sur showed up here and then basically constructed this giant green dome dome around the town, and you had guys like Jon Stewart, and you have Kyle Rayner, and you have Guy Gardner, and you have Hal Jordan, among a handful of other people. But seemingly, when this dome happened and then Abin Sur showed up, a variety of people started attacking him, and essentially they were all killed, right? So you only have a handful of people left in the town. One of the things that Jon Stewart had figured out is that seemingly gold, or the color yellow, is not impacted by the power of the Green Lantern. And so that's why the question is asked by Todd. He says, "What are you mooning over there?" And Jon just holds up and says, "A gold ring." And he says, or rather, electroplated tin, likely no real gold in it. "I think it used to be an earring, or at least part of one. I found it in the road yesterday." And of course, Todd asks, like, why would you be carrying around somebody's earring? And he says, because of whose ear it was in. And of course, this catches Todd by surprise, but Jon says, "Our friend hit the green wall so hard, his head was pulped. His skin, blood, bone, nothing penetrated the shield. Nothing except for this." And he says, "Cheap fancy dress, costume, jewelry by any measure. Why did it make it through? What are the rules? What don't we know?" And it frustrates the hell out of Jon because he grabs the earring and he throws it through the green dome. And that's where Todd's like, okay, how, right? Why is it that gold or yellow or what have you can pass through this dome, but nothing else can? Nothing gets through. No animals, no objects other than this gold earring. And the response of Jon, "I don't know, but I'm going to know everything. And I think before anything else, I should talk to Hal Jordan." Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that when all this initially popped off, Hal Jordan was not presented as the brave individual that we're used to from the main DC universe. I wouldn't go so far as to say he was a coward, but I will say, like so many people, he panicked. So much so that he tried to shoot Abin Sur. Now, he was warned by Jon Stewart, that's a bad idea. For all you know, he could take your hand. And then what ended up happening is that after all that had popped off, Hal Jordan had just shown up with a black hand. And so what you have are kind of two stories happening at the same time, which is to say, you have what's happening right now with Sojourner talking to Hal Jordan, who has a black hand. Everything else is effectively a flashback, right? And so that's what makes this so dope, is because in essence, Hal Jordan seems to be corrupted. We don't necessarily know a whole lot about it, but we will. We do know enough to know, though, that by wielding this black hand, he launches an attack against Sojourner, kind of against his will, and it seems to overwhelm her power of the Green Lantern, but not immediately, because what she starts to do is conjure the power through her ring. Now keep in mind, we don't know how she became a Green Lantern. We do not have an answer to that question. We will in this video, but we do not have one yet. And so because of that, she is able to basically conjure a hard-like construct by pushing the darkness away. She literally makes a giant fist, which is clearly a throwback to the old school pre-crisis Hal Jordan stories in DC Comics. But that's where Sojourner tells him, right? Like, get it under control. Get all of your crap under control, or I swear to God, I will do it for you. And Hal just asks, how are you doing this? How are you controlling this green light? And so again, jumping to this flashback, Jon has this conversation with Jo, where he basically starts asking her about the wedding ring. And he's like, "I'm just wondering what it's made of, Jo. It's fine if you don't know." And of course, her response, "I was the one who picked out the damn rings, Jon. It's solid gold. She wanted something cheaper. It was our first fight." So again, you kind of have a back and forth with these two. They clearly have history together, but Jon's like, "Look, I'm not really here to pick a fight, right? It's just, there's something that I want your eyes on. There's something that I want you to see." And so what ends up happening is that, again, with Hal Jordan here, that Hal Jordan brings this kind of gold blue devil, basically, right? He's like, "Behold the blue devil." Only he's not blue, because this is an all gold, basically Funko figure made to commemorate the 10th anniversary of a pretty forgettable Wayne Tarrant movie. 0 points of articulation, naturally. And he's like, "I paid $8 for it." And so at that point, Jon's like, "All right, let's put this to the test." Because Hal Jordan gives it to Jon and he shows them, right? He's like, "I was hoping for a plastic sword or something like that, but this will definitely do." And he grabs it and sticks it through the barrier. And that's when the two of them realize, okay, gold or yellow can penetrate this thing. And even Jon notices something, right? Because the object is bigger, the effect on the barrier is stronger. And he says that, right? Interesting, definitely a stronger reaction than last time. So what do we think? And it's just kind of like, are you serious? right? Like, are you serious about this? They're really kind of caught in shock. They're just sort of flabbergasted by the fact that this is possible. And so Jo asked the question. She's like, this thing, this alien force field that totaled a speeding motorcycle right in front of us, you're telling us that it doesn't work on plastic. Now, this is a very important statement from Jon Stewart. He says, we need to stop applying the rules that we know to the unknown. Now, this is kind of a meta commentary to a degree, because as you guys are figuring out here over the course of this, a lot of the traditional rules when it comes to the Green Lantern mythos aren't necessarily in effect here. Some of that's because we're only 4 issues into Absolute Green Lantern, so not enough of the story has been told in order for us to fully understand the context of what's happening here. But the other reason why Al Ewing is essentially saying this is because we're in the Absolute Universe. This is a whole different ballgame, right? The rules that we're traditionally used to in the main DC universe may or may not apply here. And so John asked the question, have you ever heard of the Philosopher's Stone? Now, initially they haven't, right? And he says it's the central symbol of alchemy, the substance that turns base metal into gold. It can also heal wounds, prolong life, create a homunculus, restore Voldemort, light an ever-burning lamp. It's a symbol. It stands for enlightenment. What is base becomes gold through knowledge. So yes, Jo, cheap plastic can breach the barrier if it takes the form of gold. And I think that's a clue. And so she asked the question, what about actual gold? And here's a crazy thing about this. And he's just like, way ahead of you. And of course, Jon Stewart takes his grandmother's ring and he just throws it at the wall. And it's the question, let's just see what happens. And when actual gold hits the wall, it creates a substantial hole. So gold itself has a massive impact on the green wall. And seemingly the power of the Green Lantern, it has the ability to disrupt Green Lantern constructs. And so at that point, it's like, okay, cool. So let's see if everybody has gold. Let's get as much gold as we possibly can around the town. Real gold, right? Not fake plastic stuff, but real gold, which clearly means that some marriages are going to end, which is going to be a very interesting scenario for us to see. The problem is we don't get to see it because Abin Sur shows up here and he just says, Jon Stewart, judgment is in progress. And Jon Stewart is destroyed, incinerated on the spot. And he just says, Jon Stewart has been judged. And of course, this leads to Jo and Hal Jordan freaking out and attacking Abin Sur. Todd comes out with a shotgun. Todd fires off a shot. Of course, Abin Sur conjures a constructs that block the bullets. And then he just says, judgment is in progress, Todd writes, be without fear. And Abin Sur takes off. But the death of Jon Stewart leaves Jo and Hal Jordan and Todd completely and totally emotionally devastated. Because at that point, it's just kind of like, okay, so we're basically in hell. We're locked inside this town. We cannot get out. The one person who had a clue to help us get out of this, he's gone now. So why in the world is this Abin Sur even doing all of this to us in the first place? Now, here's the cool thing. We finally start getting answers. Because what you do is you pick up again here in the present day with Hal and Jo. And the Black Hand basically speaks to Hal. It says, Hal Jordan, judgment was made, but penance can be offered. Now, of course, you get this kind of red response, right? Penance, you were right. You are right. You are always right. The truth is there for all to see. God is not a ring of light. God is a big black zero, the dark circle around everything. And inside the circle is a single black star, the black star, Hal. And so what we do is we pick up with this moment in the here and now with Sojourner and Hal Jordan in the present day. And basically Hal's response to her telling him he needs to get it together is no, right? I don't want to. Now, of course, Jo kind of responds with a bit of an apology and saying that she didn't necessarily mean it, but she says, you need to snap out of this. Stop letting this thing control you, this Black Hand or whatever it is. I do not want to hurt you. And the response of Hal, I wish you could, but it will not let you. So just go. Get out while you can. So what this shows here is that the Black Hand is intermittently possessing Hal Jordan. Now, it also demonstrates a measure of sentience in the sense that the Black Hand speaks to Hal Jordan. Now, that is kind of a rule that is still maintained from the Jeff Johns days, when you actually had Black Hand, who was kind of the harbinger of the rise of the Black Lantern Corps. Basically a servant of Necron, the leader of the Black Lanterns. So you do kind of get these little moments here and there where the traditional mythos ties in. But then Hal Jordan is overtaken by the Black Hand when Jo says, look at what you did. So as you guys can probably tell, the Black Hand responds to anger. It responds to rage. Here's the other thing too. Look at Hal Jordan. Look at the way he looks. I'm really hoping here that what's happening is he's channeling the black and the red aspects of the emotional spectrum, right? Death and rage. Clearly he's pissed off, so the rage aspect makes sense, but we don't know how much of this is due to simply just the darkness and how much it's due to any other thing. It's also entirely possible here that instead of having an actual emotional spectrum the way that we're used to, love and compassion and hate and all that kind of stuff, that instead you simply just have positive versus negative. That kind of seems to be what this is, but again, I could be wrong. And so the question that Hal asks is, what happened to Evergreen, Jo? And that's when you jump back to the city. And you get this kind of conversation between Todd and Hal and Jo, where Hal is talking about actually shooting Abin Sur. Because one of the things that he had realized in the conversations with John, right, the idea that gold passes through the barrier, that sure, Abin Sur creates these green barriers in order to prevent himself from getting shot. So what would happen if Hal Jordan made gold-plated bullets? They would pass through the barrier and they could take out Abin Sur. And so at that point, Jo asked the question, right, why are we the last ones? Out of a whole town, how many of nearly 3,000 people, why are the three of us the last ones? And she's like, I'll just go ask. So she walks outside of the building and starts calling the name of Abin Sur. And this is when the answers come into play, because Abin Sur appears to her and he says, Sojourner Mullein, be without fear. And she just asks, why? Right? Why did you kill all of them? And the response of Abin Sur, them all, I do not have understanding. And he says existence ended for Jason Simmons as an accident of the barrier and his relative speed when he crashed into it on his motorcycle. Existence ended for Rita Poswell as a considered judgment, as her chaotic action ended existence for Beatrice Coles. Continued chaotic action was unacceptable. So I destroyed her because she killed somebody else in trying to kill me. But Sojourner doesn't really understand. She's like, no, I saw it happen, right? You can't just pretend that you didn't kill these people. You murdered John in front of us. You killed Guy, this whole town. You disintegrated all of them. And now you're pretending that you didn't. And the response of Abin Sur, Sojourner Mullein, no other existence has ended as an action of this Abin Sur. And that's where she puts it together. And she's like, wait, they're alive. Is that what you're saying? And he says disintegrated, taken apart, broken into constituent molecules, strong implication of end state. Have understanding. That did not occur. Guy Gardner, John Stewart, Abigail Cable, and 2,809 other existences have not ended. They exist in Oa. They are within the Omega Alpha. They are in the second stage, and judgment remains in progress. Now, here's the crazy thing, because once you start to decipher what Abin Sur is actually saying, when Abin Sur appears to someone and says, be without fear, he's not judging them and saying, are you without fear? He's saying, do not be afraid. It's cool. It's just this amazing recollection. It hit me like a ton of bricks when I figured it out. I was like, wow. Because they're all being converted into Green Lanterns. Because Sojourner asked the question, tell me what that means. What judgment? The second stage of what? If you've taken them somewhere, can you bring them back? And the response of Abin Sur, continued existence must be within light. Judgment must be made. I am the Abin Sur. Ain must be selected. Ain Rao, Ain Sur, Ain R. Initiates must be selected. Initiates against the darkness. Be without fear, Sojourner Mullein. Fear Cord. Fear the weaponers of Cord. And so it just kind of leaves her flabbergasted, because he says, now you have understanding. Judgment is in progress. That's the crazy thing, because Abin Sur coming here, it's the traditional Green Lantern mythos reworked in a new way. Instead of Abin Sur arriving on Earth like he did in the main DC universe, as a Green Lantern who was basically dying, sending his ring out for a new host, which initially was going to choose Guy Gardner and instead chose Hal Jordan, in the Absolute Universe, he shows up on this world, locks down the entire city, and says, let's begin the process of figuring out which one of you are qualified to be a Green Lantern. Now, the way in which he does it is sketchy at best, right? Somebody barges into your home, locks the door, makes it impossible for you to escape, and then starts saying things like judgment in progress. Yeah, you're going to think they have it out for you. You're going to think they mean to kill you. But again, in a lot of ways, she's left with as many questions as she has answers, because you jump back to this present moment. And Hal asks the question, what happened then, Jo? What did you do? And Jo just says, once Abin Sur started to take off, you saw what happened. He was doing that thing that he always did. He went unsolid. He was going to become a ball of light and fly up to the sky and not answer anything. So I reached out instinctively, not thinking. I did not have understanding. And she says, I didn't grab him. I reached into him, into his unsolid form. My hand went into the green flame, and my wedding ring was solid gold, like the ring John threw, the one that tore a hole in Abin Sur's barrier. And now it was inside him. I was inside the light, and the light was inside of me. She basically took the power of the Green Lantern from him. She literally absorbed that power into herself and became the new Green Lantern that way. And that's why Abin Sur says chaotic action, right? This is an unpredictable act. You are not thinking when you're making this act. Anomaly. And then she just says, you know what happened after that. The barrier came down, the flame went out, and the giant Green Lantern symbol that was floating in the air smashed into the city and detonated like a nuclear bomb. And so at that point, you switch over to the aftermath of it all, and you have this guy, right, where he asks the question, is everyone already here? And they're like, yep, right, ground team found one survivor, sir. We suspect there are others. The Nevada police say one of their controlmen is missing, and at that point, the guy's like, look, don't bore me with the details, right? I love that we've got a human resource to work with. Ground team, I'll get a double H steak box in the mail. But when I ask a question, I need you to hear the question in the question. Do you understand what I'm asking? And so he's not asking, did you find anything in terms of, are there any survivors or anything like that? Did you find anything of use? And so he asked the question, let me make it a little clear. Just how badly did Morgan screw us with that emergency broadcast? Am I about to see any sticky fingerprints from Lazarus? So again, we're getting elements from other Absolute titles. Lazarus, of course, being the organization that employs the Peacemakers in the Absolute Superman comic. And she just says they may have the knowledge, but with their ongoing situation, basically Superman, they could not get ahead of us on a response. And that's where he's like, that's exactly what I wanted to hear, because it means we're the first with boots on the ground. We've got our own little Gateway City event happening right here in Nevada. So what's basically going on here in the Absolute universe on a broader scale? It's a race to hunt superheroes, those individuals that have powers. That's the bigger narrative and the bigger story that's being told. And all these organizations are trying to get their hands on these various levels of powers so they can use them for their own ends. The military is going after Absolute Wonder Woman. Lazarus is going after Absolute Superman. Absolute Joker is going after Absolute Batman. The Flash is being hunted down, and now it's the Green Lantern. So it's a phenomenal narrative. Can't wait until the first big event happens. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. It is awesome to see that Absolute Hector Hammond is not just a giant head attached to a tiny body. It is kind of an iconic look, but it is cool to see that he's just a regular guy. But not for long. This story is going to do more to unite the Absolute universe, connecting all these different dots than any story before it. So Superman, Batman, Martian Manhunter, it's all getting pulled together. So what this does is this picks up with issue number 5. Specifically, it goes back to when Jo Mullein first became the Green Lantern from touching Abin Sur. And when that happened, Hal Jordan here, who of course is a little more panicky than we're traditionally used to, right, a little more on edge, of course has a gun in his possession and immediately draws it on Abin Sur. And Abin Sur says she has power without understanding. She is anomaly. And Hal asks the question, right, what does that mean? And Abin Sur says anomalies cannot exist in the spectrum of light. She will be sought, hunted. Be with fear, Hal Jordan. Now, that's the thing to keep in mind here, is whenever Abin Sur says a thing, what we seem to have gotten so far is that it's always the inverse, right? Be without fear, do not be afraid. Be with fear, be afraid. Fear for your friend's safety. Now, All these things are going to become important here in a little while once we actually explain how the spectrum of light works. But Hal Jordan, in this moment of panic, ends up shooting and killing Abin Sur. But in the moment before Abin Sur dies, he reaches out to Hal Jordan and grabs him, and he says, "Judgment. Judgment, Hal Jordan, the Black Hand." And that is how Hal Jordan ended up getting the Black Hand in the first place. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, when Hal Jordan becomes the Black Hand, for lack of a better word, right, the gun literally being transformed into seemingly the thing that infects him, he seems to have all the same abilities that a Green Lantern would traditionally have. And so people have been trying to reconcile, right, the Black Lantern Corps versus the Red Lantern Corps, like how does all that stuff work? And Hal Jordan asked the question, right, what did you do? And that's when Abin Sur says, "Judgment. Judgment is no longer in progress, and Abin Sur cannot now be appointed." And how far out? How far out is the world that's coming? Be with fear, Hal Jordan. Fear the Black Hand, and fear the Black Star. And so that's the crazy thing, because at that point, Abin Sur essentially dies. And so what it does is it jumps back to this current moment in the fight between Hal Jordan and Jo Mullein. So basically the Green Lantern versus what appeared to be the combination of the Black and the Red Lantern. Now, the Red Lantern aspect only really seemed to come by way of personality, because historically speaking, in DC Comics, Red Lanterns represent rage. Most all of you guys who read Green Lantern know that. And so Hal Jordan, in this moment of freaking out, right, so full of anger and so full of rage, when he had revealed to Sojourner that he had killed Abin Sur, she seemingly flipped, because any answers that they could have gotten now based on everything that's going on are gone. There's no chance to get them. So many people within the city had basically been believed to have been killed. John Stewart was yanked into the Green Lantern, so there's no way to get answers from him, even though he was the one that was seemingly able to figure out the weakness of it being the color yellow or anything made of gold. There's no Guy Gardner here at the moment. He was seemingly killed. Kyle Rayner was referenced, so there really isn't any information coming from anybody. And that's where Hal tries to justify, right? "I thought he'd killed you, Joe. The cafe fell down around us. Todd was dead under the rubble. I saw a flash of green light, and then you were gone. What could I think? That's why I pulled the trigger. And that's why all of this is happening. So what happened to you, Joe?" And she just says this, and then immediately goes on the attack against Hal Jordan. And it's like, the Green Lantern happened. Now, one of the things that I hope you guys are starting to pick up on from both of these guys, which is kind of interesting here, is they're both demonstrating some measure of uncontrollability, right, on an emotional side. That despite how well she seems composed, Sojourner feels like she's full of rage, right? She's full of confusion. She doesn't understand what's going on. Hal Jordan's emotions are pretty straightforward here. And Sojourner says, "It fell out of the sky and everything in me was screaming to get out before it hit. The next thing I know, I'm in the desert, no idea where, what direction I traveled in, until I felt a pull like a compass needle towards you." And that's where Hal says no, towards the Black Hand, because it was getting stronger and it was taking control and killing people because of her, because of you. So this power he has is partially speaking through him. And he says, "You brought the Green Lantern down. You destroyed Evergreen. You stole the power of the Abin Sur. You are anomaly, Sojourner Mullein." And that's where Sojourner starts to pick up on what's happening. And she asks the question, "Who's talking, Hal? Because you're not the one talking. Someone else is talking through you. Who is talking?" And that's where he just continues on without even answering, right? "It was you and the ring. Take off the ring, Sojourner Mullein. Take off the ring." And that's where she's just kind of like, what? Because now it's this heightened state of confusion. She doesn't know who's talking through Hal. Hal's probably not even in control of himself anymore. They keep talking about taking off the ring, and she doesn't know if taking the ring off is a good thing or a bad thing. Is she being given instructions to save her life, or is she being given instructions to weaken her in order to kill her? There's no way that she could possibly know. And so all she does is just take the risk, right? Having power is better than having no power in the face of something like this. And so she just says, "Make me." And she blasts this thing with as much power as she possibly can and then races off. And while Hal Jordan follows her as best he can, at that point you switch over to Hector Hammond, who's kind of watching everything unfold. Now, Hector Hammond in the Absolute Universe is very different from the one that we're used to in the main DC universe, physically more than anything else, right? The guy's not a giant head attached to a tiny body, but he's still every bit nefarious as he's always been. He's exceedingly rich, and one of the things we're going to find out here here in a second, is he's well aware of who Ra's al Ghul is in the Absolute Superman universe. But in the fight between Sojourner and Hal Jordan, they're basically pulled, if not potentially guided, back towards the Green Lantern. And when that happens, they're all snatched inside. And the one person that's just sitting there waiting for them is Golden John Stewart, the Gold Lantern. And he says, Sojourner Mullein, Hal Jordan, be without fear. And so that's where he goes into this exposition. And that's where we start getting answers about what's happening here. Because the question's asked, how far out is the world that's coming? And that's when you jump to Agent Chase. And that's a crazy thing. Cameron Chase, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with DC Comics, she's basically part of a supernatural investigative team in the main DC universe. And so her job is to go out there and investigate paranormal things. And all that kind of falls under Amanda Waller, or at least it did at one point in time, because Amanda Waller basically oversaw everything in terms of how the federal government monitored and managed metahuman affairs, right? Superman, Batman, The Flash, Green Lantern, Swamp Thing, John Constantine, all those things kind of fell under the purview of Amanda Waller. And Cameron Chase was just one part of that much larger equation. But in the Absolute universe, things are still the same, but a little bit different at the same time. And so when Cameron Chase is brought into this office of her superior, we're actually going to find out she's kind of the link that brings Batman, Superman, and all those different guys together. That's why this conversation is so important. Because initially they talk about her caseload, right? She says, you pulled me off Nevada and California. That leaves what? Oregon? And what's in Oregon? She says, Oregon's squared away by Tuesday. Monday? Lunch. And she says, what do I do the rest of the week? Count ceiling tiles? I told you I'm not going to transfer east. And of course her boss is like, you absolutely can't smoke in here. And so she's like, whatever. And she asks, is this about Evergreen? And he says, it's not entirely about Evergreen. And she says, so it is about Evergreen. Just say it, right? And he says, the Evergreen situation does potentially cover the relevant states. And so then she asks, California, the entire state of California? And he says, it's close enough to the border that presumably it would involve California. And that's why he kind of continues on. You know why this is. You know why I cannot put you on Evergreen. You can't even go near it. Every regulation says that. And I'm doing you a favor here, right? I'm helping you. And you see that, right? Like, tell me that you see my side. And so she asks, so did Hector Hammond buy you a beach house or what? And then she just put on administrative leave. And so we're going to circle back around to her here in a minute, because again, she's going to become important. But that's when you get this explanation from John Stewart. Because John says, all of this is Oa. Don't panic. Don't be afraid. I'm going to work to translate these concepts as best I can. Try to understand. And he says, the Abin Sur is the judge of worlds. A community is a world in miniature. So a testing ground was chosen and contained, and judgment began. On the ground, evaluation is only the first stage. The second stage is transport into the Green Lantern, and throughout it, into the presence of Oa. And he says, but Owens don't think like we do. They do not have the perspective we do. People were afraid. People died, but not everyone. And that's when you see Guy Gardner. And so that's where Sojourner is just kind of like, okay, you're alive. Like, everyone here in the town is alive. Like, we all thought they were dead. And the response of John, we're all alive, Joe. Let yourself know it. Let yourself understand it. We're all together here in the place of understanding, and we are all without fear. And that's the crazy thing, because in turn, Hal Jordan says, fear is all I can feel. It's the hand. The hand does not like to be here. And Guy Gardner chimes in, there are 4 levels of light. Cord is the lowest, then Rao, then Sir, then R. Chaotic action, restraint from action, correct action, total understanding, enlightenment. Now, this is an important thing here, because what is Rao? I mean, if you guys are familiar with the Superman mythos, you guys know Rao is the god of the Kryptonians. And so there's a lot of theories out there that at some point along the line, the Kryptonians were visited. Right, they were visited by an Abin Sur. And so they in turn took this concept of restrained action and kind of adopted it as a sort of deity. And that in some capacity, they were corrupted by it. Because lest we forget, within the Absolute universe, the Kryptonian higher class, right, the upper class, were essentially going to leave all the citizens, the regular people of Krypton, to die when the planet exploded. But one of the things to keep in mind here is that the only knowledge we have of how everything unfolded on the planet Krypton is from the perspective of Superman, who was little less than a teenager at the time that it all happened. So we basically have a young child's perspective of the ending of his world. That simply means we don't actually know what really happened and if he saw it as it actually happened. Those are a lot of the questions that we still have to have answered. And so in response to everything that Guy Gardner is saying, the responses to Jo Mullein, that does not make me want to panic any less, John. Is Guy okay in there, right? Like, what is this place? What's the Green Lantern? What is Oa? What was Abin Sur judging us for? And the response of John, the Abin means the adept, the controller, the guardian. The Abin Sur was a guardian at the green level of light. The task of an Abin Sur is to select Ains, initiates into light for what's coming. Guy showed restraint, so he was judged as deserving of the red flame. And that's the crazy thing, is red flame is restraint. It's not rage. And that's where Hal asked the question, what about me? Did I deserve this? Talking in my head, telling me every dark thought I have is right. Why would he do that to me? What good is that? Right? I try so hard to control it, to stop it. And Guy Gardner responds, every flame can be controlled, but you must have understanding to command the flame. Total understanding. Control of the flame without understanding is Tomar, anomaly. And that's where Sojourner's just like, now I know there's something wrong with you guys, right? Something wrong in your heads. Acting like this is just some big lesson to learn instead of a bomb strapped to our friend, a bomb that keeps going off. And for what? Right? Hal's right. Why did Abin Sur do it? And the response of John, that I don't know. And we cannot ask because he's dead. Chaotic action. All I can tell you is what I've seen and what I've learned, what's coming for us. And he says, I've only scratched the surface, but I was chosen because I sought knowledge, Joe, selected for the gold flame. Ain R. R is the highest level. Cord, the lowest. But see, that's the Owen perspective. There are others that look in the opposite direction, who see Oa as incorrect. They take power from the dark, power without restraint. The Abin Cord, the Weaponers, the Black Stars. How far out is the world that's coming, Joe? How far out is the world of chaos? How far out is the Black Star world? How far out is Mogo? Which is crazy, because in the main DC universe, Mogo, as most of you guys know, is a Green Lantern planet. And the idea that Mogo is home to basically those individuals who choose to embrace the darkness, who choose to embrace what you and I would consider to be chaotic power, is kind of nuts. I don't know that I would use simplistic terms like evil versus good or anything like that, but the fact that he's not part of a peacekeeping force is kind of nuts, because when Hal Jordan sees it, he says, that's it, right? That's the thing in my head. It's the size of a planet, and it's in my head. And that's where Guy says, enemies fear the face of steel. And Sojourner's just like, screw this, right? She's like, I'm the Tomar or whatever, right? I'm the anomaly. All Abin Sur's power, none of his knowledge. I don't know what the rules are, not like you, John, but if I don't know the rules, then I'll have to stick to them. And if Abin Sur put this crap into you, Hal, then I'm betting I can get it out. Give me your hand. And that's where Hal's just like, no, right? It wants to kill you, so I don't want you to die. And she just says, right? It's the darkness. It wants to eat the light. But you heard what John said. It's all one thing. We're all one thing. You're just at the lowest level. And that's all, right? You're not some entity out there separate from all of this. And so she says, somebody's got to help you up. Give me your hand. And when Hal Jordan does that, she removes all that black impurity from him, right? Like there is no more black hand at that point. And Hal just goes back to seemingly his normal self. And so she's like, let's get out of here, right? And they immediately jump out of the Green Lantern. Now, of course, when that happens, all that just black ooze comes pouring out of this thing. And in turn, like the Green Lantern just disappears, but not before Hector Hammond tries to get his guys to either follow Sojourner Mullein or analyze what's going on here. Now, here's where things start getting tied together into the larger absolute universe, because while all of this is being watched and Hector Hammond is told that they can't follow Sojourner Mullein, she's just going too fast, right? She flew out of range. And so he says, okay, right? Like everyone shut up and let me think. He's like, no one's got it, right? Not us, but not Ra's al Ghul, right? We've got what it left us, the black ooze and all that data. So at least it's a win. We have at least something, right? So one of the things that this kind of demonstrates, and one of the things that we always kind of knew, is that seemingly among these various evil individuals who are running the world, Ra's al Ghul, Hector Hammond, probably absolute Joker, that there's a kind of space race, for lack of a better word, for metahuman powers, right? The same thing's happening in Absolute Flash, right? It's just all these things where they're trying to attain extreme levels of power, that metahumans are weapons to be used, to be collected, as opposed to protectors of the world. And so out on the moon, right, which is where the Green Lantern teleported to, you just kind of have John Stewart sitting there, where he asks the question, right, how far out is the world that's coming? And he says, closer every day. And then he just tells Sojourner, come back soon. And so at that point, you switch back to Cameron. And this is the part that I told you was super cool. So what goes on is she calls her partner, who turns out to be Simon Baz. So at this point right now, right, we have Kyle Rayner, who's been referenced, so we know who he exists. We have Guy Gardner, who's currently within the Green Lantern, learning the powers of the Red Flame, right? The power of restraint. We've got John Stewart. We've got Hal Jordan. The only Earthbound Green Lantern that we're missing is Jessica Cruz. And I imagine it's only a matter of time before she comes in. And so one of the things that happens is you find out that they're essentially partners, right? Simon Baz and Cameron Chase are partners here. And that's where it all kind of starts getting pulled together. Because she asked the question, right? Like, I'm your partner. Who are you even working Evergreen with? And don't tell me they put Pemberton on it. You know, he says, oh, it's not Pemberton, right? You know the rules, Cam. You're emotionally involved. And that's when you find out that Cameron Chase's ex-wife is Sojourner Mullein. That's why her superior wouldn't send her out there. Because she can't be impartial. She can't be devoid and separate of everything that's going on. And what's crazy about this is Cameron doesn't know the Sojourner's there, right? She says she wasn't there anyway, right? She told me that she never wanted to go back, unless that was a lie too. And that's where Simon's like, see, emotionally involved. You can't do it. And so he tells her, I mean, you could always take the transfer, right? You know, career-wise, it would be a phenomenal idea. And so that's where she's like, Gateway's here, right? Evergreen's here. It's all here. What's out east? The Gotham thing? Some guy, right? She's like, I'm Coast City, born and raised. I'm not leaving this town until I find out what's going on. And that's a crazy thing, right? Because now we're starting to see these parts being pulled together. We're starting to see the absolute universe being yanked together, as opposed to just Batman here, Superman there, Wonder Woman there. It's a slow build. And they pick the best guys to do it, right? Dennis Camp, Al Ewing, Jason Aaron. These are the best guys to use to start pulling worlds together, telling these slow build stories that unify everything. And here's the craziness. In the midst of all of this, Cameron gets a knock at her door while she's talking to Simon. And she just kind of starts going on a bit of a tear about Sojourner, right? Like, I thought that I was done with her, right? She's a locked box of secrets, and I was done. And she says, God, Simon, how many times can Sojourner Mullein screw up my life? Only for her to find out the person at the door is Sojourner with Hal Jordan. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Absolute Green Lantern is so good. The Absolute Universe, man, it's incredible. I'll tell you guys this, man. You put a pen in the hand of Al Ewing, and he's going to write you one of the best comic books you've ever read in your entire life. This guy's phenomenal. Anyway, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.